What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Wrestling Decoded. And today's topic is a little different from what we usually cover, because this isn't a storyline, and it isn't a decades-old rumor pulled from an old podcast. This is an active, ongoing legal case involving a current WWE performer with a pre-trial hearing that's actually scheduled for today. So we're going to walk through this carefully, stick strictly to what's actually documented in court filings and reporting, and present both sides fairly, because that's genuinely the only responsible way to cover something like this while it's still working its way through the legal system. Let's get into it. If you want the facts on wrestling's biggest real-world stories as they actually develop, rather than speculation dressed up as news, that's exactly what this channel is here for. Go ahead and subscribe before we start. The performer at the center of this is Marcel Barthel, known to WWE and AAA audiences as Ludwig Kaiser, currently portraying the character El Grande Americano, a role he took over from Chad Gable in 2025. The case traces back to April 23, 2026, at an apartment complex in Orlando, Florida, where both Barthel and the alleged victim, identified in court documents as Richard Reap, reside as neighbors. According to the timeline that's emerged through reporting and court filings, the incident took place outside an elevator on the 12th floor of the building at approximately 6:30 in the evening, a fairly mundane setting for what would eventually become a national wrestling headline. Here's where it's important to slow down, because the two accounts of what actually happened differ significantly, and neither should be treated as settled fact while the case is still active in court. Reap's version, as previously reported, alleges that Barthel and a woman, later identified in filings as WWE and AAA broadcaster Andrea Bazart, Barthel's girlfriend, were being intimately affectionate inside the elevator. Reap says he told them to have some manners and that this comment escalated into Barthel putting his hands on him shortly afterward outside the elevator doors. Barthel's account, laid out in a more recent legal filing, tells a meaningfully different story. According to his side, he and Bazart were simply hugging in the elevator when it reached the 12th floor, where Reap exited and made a loud sworn comment directed at the couple, apparently offended by the display of affection he'd witnessed moments earlier. Barthel's filing states he leaned out of the elevator to ask Reap what he'd said, seemingly confused by the outburst rather than immediately confrontational. What happened in the moments immediately after that exchange is really the crux of the entire case. Surveillance footage reportedly shows a physical altercation taking place, with Reap later found to have visible scratches and redness consistent with a physical confrontation, and Reap subsequently identifying Barthel in a police lineup afterward. Barthel was arrested and formally charged with misdemeanor battery, and he entered a not guilty plea shortly after. Since the arrest back in May, WWE has confirmed that he remains free to travel and continue performing while the case proceeds through the courts, a detail worth noting carefully because it reflects that this remains a legal matter still very much being resolved, not a settled finding of guilt that WWE is somehow ignoring. Quick pause here, because I want to be direct about something before we go further. I'm not going to speculate on what actually happened in that hallway, and honestly, neither should you based purely on secondhand reporting or comment section takes. What we can responsibly do is track the actual legal process as it unfolds, step by step, which is exactly what's made this story continue developing over the past several months, rather than just being a one-off headline that faded away. In June, Barthel's legal team filed a motion requesting a court-authorized subpoena to obtain the apartment complex's surveillance footage of the incident. According to the filing, his lawyers had already reached out directly to the complex's management beforehand, but were told the footage couldn't be released without that formal court order in hand. The motion specifically argued that access to this video was necessary to properly prepare his defense ahead of any trial. And notably, prosecutors did not oppose the request at all, which suggests both sides recognize the footage as a central, presumably clarifying piece of evidence in the case, rather than something either party wanted to keep buried. By late June, the defense had been granted access to review that footage in full. Then, just this month, Barthel's legal team took things a significant step further, filing a motion to dismiss the battery charge entirely rather than simply continuing to prepare for trial. This is where the case takes its most consequential legal turn so far. The defense is invoking Florida's Stand Your Ground law, arguing that Barthel used non-deadly force only because he believed it was necessary to protect himself and his girlfriend from what he perceived as an imminent threat in that moment. For those unfamiliar with how this particular law functions, stand your ground essentially allows a person to use force in self-defense without any legal obligation to first attempt retreating from the situation, provided they can demonstrate a reasonable belief that such force was genuinely necessary at the time. Whether that specific legal standard is actually met here is now a question sitting squarely in front of the court to determine, not something settled one way or the other by either side's public statements or legal filings alone. This all comes to a head today, July 16, 2026, with a scheduled pre-trial conference, the point in the process where prosecution and defense typically attempt to work out whether the case proceeds toward a negotiated plea agreement or instead heads all the way to an actual trial, and where a judge may also formally rule on that pending motion to dismiss. There's also a second, separate layer to this story worth understanding clearly, because it runs on its own independent legal track. Reports have indicated that Reap, the alleged victim, has retained an attorney specializing in personal injury and civil litigation, suggesting he may be exploring a civil lawsuit against Barthel entirely independent of the ongoing criminal case. It's worth being precise about the distinction here because it's easy to conflate the two. The battery charge is a criminal matter prosecuted by the state itself, focused specifically on whether a crime occurred and what punishment, if any, should follow as a result. A civil suit, if one is actually filed down the line, would be a completely separate legal action brought directly by Reap as a private individual, typically seeking financial compensation for damages rather than any criminal penalty against Barthel. These two tracks can run entirely in parallel with each other, and one doesn't necessarily have to resolve a particular way for the other to still proceed independently. Throughout all of this ongoing legal drama, WWE has continued moving forward with Barthel's on-screen career largely uninterrupted, which has itself become part of the broader conversation around this story. He recently competed in a high-profile mask versus mask match against Chad Gable, the original performer behind the El Grande Americano character before Barthel took it over, at AAA's Noche de los Grandes event in Monterrey, Mexico. WWE has since even run a charity auction for the mask he wore during that specific appearance, with proceeds benefiting a foundation supporting Mexican children battling serious illnesses. It's a small but telling reminder that, at least publicly and on camera, WWE hasn't paused or altered his career trajectory at all while this legal situation continues quietly unfolding behind the scenes. So where does that actually leave things as of today, sitting right at the pretrial conference? The core facts everyone genuinely agrees on are fairly limited, but clear. There was a physical altercation outside an elevator on April 23rd. Barthel was arrested and charged with misdemeanor battery as a result, and he's pleaded not guilty to that charge. Beyond those bare facts, the two men involved describe fundamentally different sequences of events leading up to that altercation, and the case now hinges heavily on a legal defense that specifically argues Barthel's actions were justified self-protection rather than an unprovoked attack on his neighbor. Today's pretrial conference should provide the next real concrete update on where this actually heads, whether that's an outright dismissal, some kind of negotiated resolution between both parties, or the case formally moving forward toward an actual trial. I'll be honest about something else too, because it feels important to say directly. Stories like this move quickly and quietly change shape with nearly every new filing that comes out, and it's genuinely easy for wrestling media and fans simply repeating what they've read online to flatten a complicated, actively disputed situation into a single simple headline that doesn't capture any of the real nuance underneath it. The responsible thing to do here is exactly what we just walked through together. Lay out what's actually documented in the record, attribute each competing account clearly to the person who actually made it, and let the legal process itself, not social media speculation or wrestling forum debate, ultimately determine what really happened that evening. What's your take on how WWE has handled this whole situation so far, letting him continue performing on television while the case remains genuinely active in court? Let me know your honest thoughts down in the comments, and I'll absolutely keep tracking this story as it continues to develop. And if you want the real, properly sourced updates on wrestling's biggest ongoing real-world stories, make sure you're subscribed to Wrestling Decoded. We'll have the next update on this one the moment there's actual concrete news to report.